Mid-1943. The war has reached its peak in both the Atlantic and the Pacific. Battles rage across thousands of miles of ocean. The U.S. Navy is pushing deeper into enemy territory, but every battle leaves scars. Ships take heavy damage. Some are barely afloat. Traditionally, a crippled warship must return to a permanent naval base for repairs. This journey takes weeks. In the Pacific, it can take months. Each ship pulled from the line leaves the fleet weaker. The Japanese and Germans know this, and their strategies depend on it. The Navy faces a crisis. Pearl Harbor is working at full capacity, but it is not enough. The fleet cannot wait for slow repairs so far from the front. In the Atlantic, German U-boats hunt convoys and strike at warships. They believe that every sinking is permanent. To the Germans, a ship sent to the bottom is one less threat to their operations. In secret, the Americans begin a bold project. Instead of bringing ships home for repair, they will bring the repair facilities to the ships. Engineers design massive floating dry docks. These are not fixed structures built into the shore. They are made of modular steel sections, each one as long as a football field. Each section is self-powered and can be towed by tugs across the ocean. When the sections arrive at their destination, they lock together like giant puzzle pieces, forming a single enormous platform. When assembled, these dry docks can lift entire ships out of the water. Smaller versions can raise destroyers and submarines. Larger ones, called Advanced Base Sectional Docks or ABSDs, can hold heavy cruisers and even battleships. Some stretch nearly 1,000 feet long with a lifting capacity of more than 90,000 tons. They are outfitted with cranes, workshops, fuel lines, and living quarters for crews. A ship enters the dock, the massive platform rises beneath it, and the vessel sits high and dry. Welders, mechanics, and electricians get to work immediately. This new system transforms how the Navy fights. Instead of sailing damaged ships back to San Diego or Norfolk, commanders can send them to nearby forward bases. A ship that might have been lost for months is ready to fight again within days. The first ABSDs arrive quietly in the Pacific in late 1943. One sets up near Pearl Harbor, another at Midway. As the island-hopping campaign pushes west, more appear at remote locations like Ulithi Atoll. Smaller auxiliary floating dry docks, or AFDs, are stationed at other strategic points. In the Atlantic, similar docks operate near Newfoundland and the Azores. At first, the Axis powers know nothing about this innovation. In the Atlantic, a U-boat attacks a U.S. cruiser near a remote island. The ship limps away heavily damaged. The German crew believes they have removed it from the war. Weeks later, to their surprise, the same cruiser is seen back on patrol. Reports filter back to German command. The news does not make sense. It happens again and again. German officers grow suspicious. They think there must be hidden island shipyards or secret bases. They cannot explain how these ships are being repaired so quickly. Then, in early 1944, a Luftwaffe reconnaissance plane photographs something strange. The image shows a massive floating platform at sea with a large ship raised above the waves. The platform is unlike anything they have seen before. When the photograph reaches Kriegsmarine headquarters, disbelief follows. Admiral Karl Donitz studies the image. Some officers think it is a trick. Others argue that the Americans have developed a mobile repair base. If true, it changes everything. The Germans have built their naval strategy on the idea of attrition. They rely on sinking Allied ships faster than they can be replaced. Now, even a badly damaged ship can return to combat in a matter of days. More reports arrive, confirming the truth. Floating dry docks are moving across the ocean, appearing wherever the Americans need them. They are hard to target and even harder to destroy. German intelligence realizes they are facing a new type of naval logistics. Their efforts to cripple the U.S. fleet are failing. On the American side, sailors witness this transformation firsthand. A destroyer returns from combat, its hull split open by a torpedo. The crew expects to be sent home, maybe never to return. Instead, they sail into a remote harbor where a massive steel platform waits. As the dock fills with water, the ship glides inside. Pumps engage and slowly the platform rises. The destroyer lifts clear of the sea. Repair crews swarm over it, cutting, welding, and replacing damaged sections. Work continues day and night. Within days, the destroyer slides back into the water, repaired and ready. The crew sails out again, shocked by the speed and skill of the process. By early 1944, floating dry docks are a regular sight at forward bases. They keep American ships in fighting shape and allow continuous operations across the vast Pacific. German officers, once certain they could win a war of attrition, now face a grim reality. Their enemy has found a way to fight without pause, and the ocean no longer offers safety or rest. The floating dry docks were unlike anything the world had seen before. Built in secret, they were made to solve a problem that could decide the outcome of the war. In the vast Pacific, distances were measured in thousands of miles. A damaged battleship or carrier had to travel all the way back to a major naval yard, sometimes taking weeks just to reach the first safe port. Every day spent sailing home was a day the fleet was weaker. American engineers set out to design something new. Their answer was a dry dock that could move wherever the fight was. Each dock was made of large steel sections. These sections were massive, each one as long as a football field and as wide as a city street. They were hollow with ballast tanks that allowed them to sink and rise. Each section carried its own engines, pumps, and control rooms so it could be towed across open water or moved under its own power. Once the sections arrived, they locked together using heavy steel pins and latches, forming a single, solid structure. The number of sections used depended on the size of the ships that needed to be repaired. When fully assembled, the largest docks stretched over 900 feet. Some were long enough to lift a battleship or a fleet carrier completely out of the water. These massive platforms were strong enough to handle more than 90,000 tons. The dock worked by sinking its sections below the surface, letting the damaged ship float inside, and then pumping out the water. As the tanks emptied, the dock slowly rose, lifting the vessel clear of the sea. This gave repair crews full access to the hull, propellers, and lower decks, areas impossible to reach while the ship was afloat. The floating dry docks were more than just platforms. They were fully equipped repair bases. They had cranes large enough to lift engines and heavy guns. Machine shops were built into their decks so parts could be made on site. Fuel lines and storage tanks allowed refueling at the same location where repairs were done. Living quarters were built into some sections so repair crews could stay on station for months at a time. A single dock could house hundreds of men, including welders, electricians, carpenters, and engineers. These crews worked around the clock to return damaged ships to service. Smaller docks, known as auxiliary floating dry docks or AFDs, were designed to handle submarines, destroyers, and supply ships. Larger docks, called Advanced Base Sectional Docks or ABSDs, were made for heavy cruisers and battleships. Each type could be deployed wherever it was needed most. Because the docks were modular, they could be shipped in pieces on cargo vessels or towed individually behind tugboats. Once in place, they became permanent repair facilities until it was time to move them again. One of the most impressive of these was AFDB-1. When fully assembled, it stretched long enough to lift a ship the size of the USS Iowa, one of the most powerful battleships ever built. The sheer size of these structures gave the U.S. Navy a strategic edge. Before their introduction, forward bases were limited to small islands with natural harbors. These islands often lacked the infrastructure to handle heavy warships. By bringing the dry dock to the island, the Navy turned almost any location into a full-scale repair yard. The docks were designed with protection in mind. Because they floated, they could be moved if they came under threat. If enemy aircraft or submarines discovered their position, the sections could be separated and relocated to a safer area. This made them almost impossible to target permanently. Unlike fixed shipyards, which could be bombed or shelled, these mobile docks stayed one step ahead of enemy attacks. Their operation was a feat of engineering. To lift a battleship, crews had to carefully balance the ballast tanks in each section. Pumps moved thousands of gallons of water per minute to ensure the dock stayed level as it rose. Any miscalculation could tip the entire platform and risk the ship it carried. Specialized teams managed this process, coordinating their actions with precision. Once the ship was fully raised, scaffolding and work platforms were erected around it. Crews immediately began welding, cutting, and installing new parts. These docks gave damaged ships a second life. In the Pacific, a destroyer hit by a Japanese torpedo could sail into a forward base instead of retreating thousands of miles to Pearl Harbor. Within days, its hull would be patched, engines repaired, and weapons reloaded. In the Atlantic, Liberty ships damaged by U-boat attacks could be lifted, repaired, and sent back to the convoys that kept Britain supplied. The presence of these mobile docks allowed the U.S. Navy to maintain constant pressure on enemy forces. Ships no longer disappeared for months after taking damage. Instead, they returned to the fight quickly, often surprising the enemy who believed they had sunk them for good. For the men who worked on these docks, the task was grueling but vital. They labored under harsh conditions, often in remote locations exposed to tropical storms or freezing winds. Despite the challenges, their efforts kept the fleet alive and ready. By early 1944, floating dry docks were stationed across the Pacific and Atlantic. They became essential tools for naval warfare, providing the kind of flexibility and reach that no other navy in the world possessed. Their design and function were a quiet revolution in wartime logistics, hidden behind the front lines but felt in every battle fought at sea. The early years of the war were hard on the U.S. Navy. Pearl Harbor left battleships and cruisers sunk or heavily damaged. In the months that followed, Japanese forces struck island after island, forcing the Navy to fight across a vast ocean. Every major engagement ended with more ships needing repair. For many vessels, there was no choice but to make the long journey back to San Diego or Norfolk. This meant weeks spent out of action, leaving the fleet weaker at the front. Commanders knew they were fighting with only part of their strength at any given time. The Navy needed a solution. Without one, they could not keep up the pace of operations. They could not afford to send ships thousands of miles for repairs while the enemy continued to press forward. Engineers and planners came up with a radical idea. Instead of bringing the ships home, they would bring the repair facilities to the ships. This idea took shape in the form of floating dry docks. These massive structures would allow damaged ships to be lifted and repaired near the front lines. When the first floating dry docks were deployed, they were kept secret. Only those who needed to know were informed. Sailors and officers were amazed when they saw them for the first time. A ship that had limped away from battle could glide into the waiting dock. Pumps would flood ballast tanks to lower the dock beneath the surface. Once the ship was in place, the tanks were pumped dry. Slowly, the dock would rise, lifting the ship clear of the sea. Repair crews immediately went to work. Around the clock, welders, carpenters, and engineers patched holes, replaced damaged sections, and restored weapons. In a matter of days, the ship would be ready for combat again. This system transformed naval warfare for the Americans. Instead of losing valuable ships for months, they could keep their fleet in the fight. The turnaround time dropped drastically. A carrier damaged in one battle might return to action before the enemy even realized it had been repaired. It was an advantage no other navy possessed at the time. The Germans began to notice strange patterns. In the Atlantic, a U-boat wolf pack attacked a U.S. cruiser near a remote atoll. The submarine crews reported seeing the ship listing heavily, its hull torn apart by torpedoes. They were certain it would sink or at least be out of service for a long time. But weeks later, another U-boat reported seeing the same cruiser escorting a convoy. The report was dismissed at first. Commanders assumed the submarine crews had mistaken it for a different ship of the same class. Then it happened again. Another damaged vessel reappeared too quickly to make sense. German officers grew uneasy. Some wondered if the Americans had built hidden island bases where repairs were being carried out in secret. Others thought the reports might be part of a deception operation meant to confuse them. Still, the sightings kept coming. The mystery deepened when reconnaissance planes began photographing remote areas in the Pacific. One day, a Luftwaffe crew spotted something unusual. From high altitude, they saw what appeared to be a massive platform floating on the water. A large warship sat atop it, raised completely out of the sea. The photographs they brought back caused a stir in Berlin. When the images reached Kriegsmarine headquarters, Admiral Karl Donitz examined them personally. The idea of a mobile repair dock was difficult to accept. At first, he refused to believe it. He thought it might be a trick or a mistake. Some of his officers agreed. They argued that the scale of the construction required seemed impossible, especially in the middle of the ocean. Others insisted the photographs were genuine. They pointed out details that matched known American ship designs. As more evidence arrived, the truth became harder to deny. The Americans had developed a way to keep their fleet repaired without relying on fixed bases. This revelation shocked the German High Command. Their strategy relied on attrition. U-boats were meant to sink ships faster than the Allies could build new ones. If a damaged ship could be repaired and sent back into action almost immediately, the entire strategy began to crumble. In meetings, German commanders debated what to do. Some proposed targeting the floating dry docks directly. But finding them was difficult. They were mobile and could be moved if threatened. Even when their locations were known, striking them was not easy. U-boats could not approach heavily guarded forward bases. Long-range bombers faced the risk of fighter interception. The docks were as well protected as any port city. Meanwhile, American crews were growing accustomed to the new system. For sailors, the experience was almost surreal. A destroyer would come limping into a forward base, its hull ripped open by a torpedo. The crew might assume the ship was finished. Instead, they watched as the floating dock took it aboard. In a matter of hours, the work began. The sound of hammers, welding torches, and machinery filled the air day and night. Men worked tirelessly, often in dangerous conditions, to return the ship to fighting shape. The speed of these repairs had a profound effect on morale. Sailors who expected to be sent home for months were back at sea in days. Commanders could plan operations knowing their forces would be ready sooner than the enemy expected. For the Japanese and Germans, it became almost impossible to predict the size and strength of the American fleet at any given time. As more floating docks were deployed, the effect multiplied. A ship damaged near the front could be repaired close by, while new ships kept arriving from American shipyards. This created a relentless cycle of pressure. The enemy believed they had sunk a vital warship, only to face it again in the next battle. By early 1944, German intelligence had no illusions left. They understood what they were up against. The Americans had solved one of the hardest problems of naval warfare. They could fight continuously, never forced to retreat for lack of repairs. Admiral Donitz, once confident that U-boats could strangle Allied shipping, now faced a grim reality. Even his most successful wolf packs could no longer sink ships faster than the Americans could return them to the fight. The men of the U.S. Navy had lived through hard days in the early part of the war. They had seen their ships sink at Pearl Harbor. They had watched friends die in flames at sea. They knew that when a vessel was badly damaged, it meant weeks or even months before it could return to the fight. Often, they never saw the ship again. It either sank or disappeared across the ocean to a distant yard, leaving the men to wonder if it would ever come back. The first time a floating dry dock lifted a damaged ship, many sailors did not believe what they were seeing. A destroyer, its hull twisted and blackened from a torpedo hit, came limping into a forward base. The crew expected orders to strip the ship of weapons and prepare to be sent home. Instead, they were told to stand by. As they watched, massive steel platforms floated out into position. The destroyer was guided between them. Pumps rumbled as the dock sank beneath the surface. Slowly, the damaged ship settled into place. Then, as the tanks were pumped dry, the entire platform began to rise. In a few hours, the ship sat high above the water, like a model on a table. The sailors stared in silence. Many had never seen a ship out of the water before. Men pointed to holes ripped through the hull and damage hidden below the surface. Welders climbed aboard immediately, their torches cutting through metal. Repair crews swarmed the vessel. Cranes swung overhead, lifting new sections of steel into place. The work never stopped. Floodlights turned the night into day as repairs continued around the clock. For the crew, It was more than a technical feat, it was a moment of hope. They had feared their ship was finished. Now they saw it being rebuilt before their eyes. One sailor later wrote that it felt like watching a wounded friend being healed. Within days, the destroyer was ready to sail again. The men boarded her with a sense of pride. They had been given back their ship, and with it, their fighting spirit. This scene repeated across the Pacific and Atlantic. Every time a ship rose from a floating dock, the same mix of awe and relief spread through the crews. Stories traveled quickly. Sailors told of watching battleships and carriers rise from the sea, patched and painted, ready to strike again. These tales gave confidence to the men still fighting. They knew that if their ship was hit, it might not mean the end. Help could be closer than they imagined. On the other side of the war, the reaction was very different. German officers grew alarmed as they pieced together what was happening. At first, they could not understand how damaged American ships were returning so quickly. Reports of the same vessel being seen in two battles, only weeks apart, seemed impossible. When photographs of the floating dry docks finally reached Berlin, many officers refused to believe them. The idea of moving a repair yard across the ocean went against everything they knew. As more evidence came in, the truth became clear. The Americans had developed a system that made traditional German strategy useless. A U-boat commander, captured later in the war, tried to explain the feeling. He said, "We thought sinking a ship was permanent. Now it was like fighting ghosts." His words spread through Allied intelligence briefings. They captured the frustration felt by German crews. Every successful attack seemed to mean less than before. German naval leaders faced bitter debates. Some wanted to divert resources to hunt down the docks. Others argued it was impossible. The docks were mobile and heavily defended. Even if one was destroyed, another could be built. The knowledge that they could not strike a decisive blow weighed heavily on the U-boat force. For the men of the wolf packs, the change was demoralizing. They risked their lives to sink a destroyer or cruiser, only to hear weeks later that the same ship was back at sea. Submarine crews began to feel their victories slipping away. Their patrols grew longer and more dangerous, but their efforts no longer shifted the balance of power. Back in the United States, the floating dry docks were a closely guarded secret. The Navy knew that if the enemy understood their full value, they would become prime targets. Sailors were forbidden to speak of them in letters home. Even high-ranking officers discussed them only in secure communications. Newspapers received strict instructions not to publish photographs or descriptions. To the public, these structures were invisible. As the war went on, hints began to appear. Families wrote to sailors and heard stories of ships returning from battles faster than anyone thought possible. Rumors spread, but few people outside the Navy knew the truth. It was not until later, when the war turned in the Allies' favor, that details began to emerge. When the information was finally released, Americans were amazed. Newspapers described the floating docks as engineering miracles. Photographs showed battleships sitting high above the water in places no shipyard had ever existed. For many civilians, it was the first clear sign of how American industry and ingenuity had shaped the war. For the men who had worked on the docks, the attention was strange. They had spent months in remote locations, exposed to heat, storms, and constant danger. Their work was grueling and unglamorous. They rarely saw combat, but they knew their efforts were vital. When they finally read about their role in the newspapers, they understood how important their labor had been. Among sailors, pride ran deep. A ship that might have been lost forever now sailed again because of these mobile docks. The crews who fought aboard those ships never forgot the sight of their vessel being lifted from the sea and saved. To them, the floating docks were not just machines. They were lifelines, proof that no matter how far they were from home, someone was working to keep them in the fight. For the Germans, the image of those same docks became a symbol of frustration. They had believed they could win by sinking more ships than the Americans could build. Now, even a sinking was no longer certain. Every battle felt like a fight against an enemy that could never be worn down. The floating dry docks changed not just the logistics of war, but the morale of those who fought it on both sides of the ocean. By 1944, The impact of the floating dry docks was being felt across every ocean where the U.S. Navy operated. The docks gave the Americans something no other navy possessed: the ability to repair ships wherever they were needed. For commanders planning campaigns, this changed everything. Before, a damaged carrier or battleship meant weeks of lost time while the vessel made the long trip back to a permanent yard. Now, a crippled ship could be patched near the front and returned to battle almost immediately. This allowed the U.S. to fight without pause. The island-hopping campaign in the Pacific depended on a steady flow of ships. Each assault required carriers, cruisers, destroyers, transports, and supply vessels working together. Losses were expected. The Japanese counted on this. They believed that if they could inflict heavy damage, they could slow or even stop the American advance. With floating dry docks in place, that strategy no longer worked. A ship that might have been written off could be saved and returned to service within days. Entire task forces stayed at full strength as the fighting moved closer to Japan's home islands. At Ulithi Atoll, one of the largest forward bases, floating dry docks became the heart of the operation. Damaged ships streamed in from battles at Leyte Gulf, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa. They were lifted out of the water, repaired, and sent back to sea in a constant cycle. The tempo of operations increased to a level the Japanese could not match. Instead of waiting months for repairs, American fleets struck again and again, giving the enemy no time to regroup. In the Atlantic, the same pattern emerged. German U-boats had been sinking ships at a terrifying rate in the early years of the war. Their strategy relied on overwhelming the Allies by destroying merchant vessels and warships faster than they could be replaced. Floating dry docks disrupted this plan. Liberty ships damaged in convoy attacks were lifted and fixed quickly, often returning to duty before the Germans realized they had survived. Warships that would have been out of action for long periods were back on escort duty almost immediately. The effect on the supply chain was profound. Britain depended on supplies from across the Atlantic to stay in the fight. Every ton of food, fuel, and equipment counted. When ships stayed in service, the lifeline to Britain remained strong. By 1944, the Allies were moving vast amounts of men and material to prepare for the invasion of Europe. The floating dry docks played a quiet but essential role in keeping those convoys running smoothly. For American commanders, this capability provided flexibility. They no longer had to plan around the slow turnaround of damaged vessels. Fleet movements could be aggressive. Battles could be fought knowing that repairs would happen close to the action. This meant the Navy could sustain pressure on both Japan and Germany at the same time. It also allowed for simultaneous operations in multiple theaters, something the Axis could not do. For the Germans, the consequences were devastating. U-boat commanders had built their tactics on the belief that every sinking reduced Allied strength. In the early war years, this was true. Ships lost in convoy battles took months to replace. Each success brought them closer to their goal of cutting Britain off from its supplies. By 1943, that belief began to crumble. A U-boat would torpedo a freighter or warship, only to hear reports that the same vessel had been seen again weeks later. This was not just a matter of numbers. It was psychological. Crews risked their lives on every patrol, enduring cold, hunger, and constant danger. They needed to believe their sacrifices made a difference. When they realized the ships they sank could come back, morale began to sink with them. Some sailors spoke of it as fighting ghosts. The enemy seemed endless, no matter how many ships they destroyed. German intelligence worked hard to understand what was happening. When photographs of the floating dry docks reached Admiral Donitz, he saw the scale of the problem. The docks themselves were almost impossible to attack. They were mobile, heavily defended, and scattered across vast stretches of ocean. Even if one was destroyed, others would continue to operate. This meant there was no single point of failure the Germans could target. Their strategy of attrition, which had worked in the First World War, was no longer effective. As the war progressed, U-boats became less of a threat. Allied convoys were better protected, and new technology like sonar and radar made submarine attacks more difficult. The floating dry docks magnified these changes. They ensured that every ship damaged in an encounter with a U-boat could return to service quickly. Even a near sinking did not guarantee a permanent loss for the Allies. For Japan, the docks were just as disruptive. Japanese naval doctrine relied on decisive battles. They hoped to inflict crushing losses that would force the Americans to retreat and negotiate. At battles like Leyte Gulf, they committed their remaining fleet to try to stop the U.S. advance. In earlier wars, destroying a few key ships might have turned the tide. But in this conflict, the Americans could bring ships back almost as fast as they were damaged. Even when the Japanese inflicted serious harm, the effect was temporary. The presence of the floating dry docks allowed American forces to keep advancing steadily toward Japan. There were no long pauses to rebuild. Each island was taken, repaired ships returned to the fight, and the next assault was launched. Japanese commanders watched their perimeter shrink, unable to recover between battles. The docks turned the vast Pacific into a network of forward bases, giving the U.S. Navy unmatched reach and endurance. By early 1945, the pattern was clear. The Allies operated without interruption. Their fleets grew stronger, not weaker, as the war dragged on. The Axis powers, meanwhile, were locked into strategies that no longer worked. German U-boats, once the terror of the seas, had lost their edge. Japanese admirals could no longer hope to deliver a decisive blow. The floating dry docks did not win battles directly, but they made those victories possible. Their presence ensured that the Allies could fight at a pace the Axis could never match. In the end, these mobile repair bases changed the nature of naval warfare. They allowed the United States to maintain constant pressure on its enemies, pushing forward without pause. For the Axis, they represented a problem that could not be solved. Every torpedo, every bomb, every carefully planned attack was blunted by the knowledge that the ship they struck might return to the fight almost immediately. This shift in momentum played out in every ocean, shaping the course of the war and sealing the fate of those who relied on older ways of thinking. When the war ended in 1945, the floating dry docks did not disappear. They had proven their value in ways few could have imagined at the start of the conflict. The docks were disassembled and towed to bases around the world. Some were returned to the United States, while others stayed overseas, ready to support the peacetime Navy. Their usefulness extended far beyond combat. In the years that followed, they became a permanent part of naval logistics. The U.S. Navy understood that the world had changed. The lessons learned from fighting across two oceans showed the need for mobile infrastructure. Permanent bases could not always be built in the right place, and international tensions meant new conflicts could break out anywhere. The floating dry docks provided a way to bring essential repair capability to distant waters without relying on foreign ports. This flexibility shaped naval planning for decades. Many of the same docks that served in World War II remained in active use for years afterward. Some were stationed at key Cold War locations like Guam, Subic Bay, and Diego Garcia. They supported fleets that patrolled during tense standoffs with the Soviet Union. Others stayed in American ports, where they handled overflow work from traditional shipyards. Even as new technology emerged, the basic design of the floating dock proved sound. By the 1960s, some of these docks were still operating in forward areas. During the Vietnam War, they again showed their worth. American warships damaged by mines or enemy fire did not always need to return to a major base. They could be lifted, repaired, and sent back to duty using the same techniques pioneered 2 decades earlier. In a very direct way, these structures linked two very different conflicts, proving that the ideas behind them were not just wartime improvisations but lasting solutions. The concept also spread to other nations. Allied navies studied the American experience closely. Some built their own versions, while others acquired surplus docks from the United States. By the late 20th century, floating repair facilities were a standard feature of major fleets around the world. The designs became more specialized, with some docks built for submarines, others for smaller patrol craft, and still others for the largest modern carriers. In time, their role evolved. As global trade expanded, floating dry docks began to appear in commercial shipping. The same features that made them valuable in war, mobility, modular construction, and speed, were useful in peacetime industries. They allowed companies to service cargo ships and tankers without relying solely on fixed ports. For the men who had served on these docks during the war, Their continued use was a point of quiet pride. Many of them never saw combat in the traditional sense. They did their work far from the headlines, cutting steel, welding seams, and handling complex machinery under harsh conditions. They understood, perhaps better than anyone, how vital their labor had been. Seeing those same docks at work decades later was a reminder of their contribution. The cultural memory of the floating dry docks grew slowly. During the war, strict secrecy surrounded them. Photographs were rare, and descriptions were carefully censored. After the war, as details were released, the public began to appreciate what these structures had accomplished. Newspapers and magazines ran features describing the moving shipyards that had kept the fleet alive. Veterans shared their stories, and historians began to include the docks in their accounts of the naval campaigns. For many Americans, the docks came to symbolize the nation's industrial might. They showed how the United States had not only built massive fleets but also found ways to sustain them under extreme conditions. In museums and documentaries, images of ships rising from the sea on towering steel platforms became powerful symbols of ingenuity and determination. Today, sections of the original World War II docks can still be seen. Some have been preserved as historical artifacts. Visitors walking across their decks can imagine what it was like during the war, when these platforms buzzed with activity day and night. Others have been repurposed for modern work, quietly serving in ports around the world. Even when they are no longer lifting battleships, they remain part of the global maritime landscape. Modern navies continue to build on the ideas first developed during World War II. New modular platforms are designed not only for combat but also for humanitarian missions and disaster relief. In recent years, floating repair and support facilities have been deployed after tsunamis, hurricanes, and other crises. They provide immediate help where permanent infrastructure has been destroyed. The same mobility that once kept warships fighting now helps save lives in times of peace. The technology has advanced, but the core principles remain the same. A floating dock must be strong, stable, and easy to move. It must support complex operations while operating far from shore. These requirements were first solved under the pressure of global war. The fact that they continue to work today speaks to the skill of the engineers and builders who created them. Though many of the original docks are gone, their influence is everywhere. Modern logistics ships, mobile bases, and temporary ports all trace their lineage back to those early experiments. The floating dry docks of World War II were not just tools for a single conflict. They were part of a shift in how navies think about distance, time, and readiness. For historians, they represent a hidden story of the war. While battles like Midway and Leyte Gulf are well known, the work done behind the scenes is often overlooked. Without the ability to repair ships quickly, those victories might not have been possible. The floating docks stand as reminders that wars are won not only by those who fight at the front, but also by those who keep the machines of war in motion. In shipyards, museums, and remote ports, the legacy of these structures endures. Whether they are raising a modern destroyer or simply resting as relics of the past, they carry with them the history of a time when the outcome of the world's greatest conflict depended on steel platforms floating in far-off seas. Their story is still unfolding, carried forward by every new vessel that rises from the water to fight again or to serve in peace.